The last of these arguments from the environmentalists appeals to needs and interests. And so the basic idea here is that we can say that even entities other than animals and other than humans have needs and interests in some sense. So we can talk about what plants need and what plant interests are, what plants want. We can talk about what ecosystems need and want. We can talk about what species need and want, and so on. And even some environmentalists have sort of described these things as like communicating their needs and wants to us if we can listen. And you can even imagine, I think Sober mentions it at one point, talking about what a mountain needs or wants, or a lake needs or wants. Okay. Now the problem with this, Sober says, is that first of all, it's just not clear that these things really have needs or wants. But if we're going to say that they do, I mean, it's clear that non-human animals, at least many of them, have needs and wants. Like, we know what it means to use those terms of needs and interests, or needs and desires, needs and wants, with dogs, cats, primates, any kind of like the more developed, the mammals that are sort of closer in evolutionary terms to ourselves, or in behavioral terms to ourselves. We know what it means to say that they want something or they need something. But to say that an ecosystem wants something, or a species wants something, it's much harder to know what's being said there. And so the worry is that it's just a kind of metaphor, but it's not literally the same thing that's being attributed to them. And so Sober ends up saying we basically have two choices. We either have to admit that it doesn't really make sense to use these words to describe non-sentient beings, except in a very loose metaphorical way that doesn't tell us anything about what we should do. Okay. So either it doesn't make sense to describe species and ecosystems as having wants and interests, or if we do describe them as having wants and interests, we have to recognize that lots of other things in our world have wants and interests to exactly the same extent and in the same ways. So we would have to describe inanimate objects like rocks as having wants and needs and interests, tools as having wants, needs, and interests, machines, or automobiles. I mean, does it make sense to say what a car wants or what a car needs, what a car's interests are? And even like human social institutions like corporations. And so at this point, because we've now described lots of human things and human created things as having wants, needs, and interests in the same sense that we can say ecosystems and species do, then we haven't yet said why we should value the wants, needs, and interests of ecosystems and species over those of these other things that we can say also have wants, needs, and interests. Like, if the interests of something are just whatever it needs in order to continue existing, then you could say an ecosystem has it wants to retain its apex predators. Okay, it wants, so for instance, in the mountain ecosystem that Leopold describes, the mountain wants to preserve the wolves. Okay, but if we say that about what a mountain wants, we could just as well say, by the same kind of reasoning, we could say, well, what McDonald's Corporation wants is to continue to sell hamburgers and to increase shareholder profits. Now, once we go that far and say that there are wants in both of these cases, then how do we adjudicate between those wants when they come into conflict? And so if we take this second route, then we don't have sufficient guidance as to what we should do or why we should particularly care about the natural system's needs and wants versus the human system's needs and wants. I want to discuss just a few more points from Sober's essay. So this wasn't asked about in the reading response, but I think it's an important point he makes near the end of the essay. He considers one more, you could consider it a kind of argument, but I think he describes it more as a kind of bias or kind of assumption. But I'm going to present it to you as an argument just to kind of keep it in the same form as some of the other ideas we've discussed. So it would go something like this. We humans, or we modern humans, think too individualistically. We need to recognize that wholes, such as ecosystems, have intrinsic value that precedes and has priority over the value of the individuals that make them up or are a part of them, such as individual organisms. Basically, wholes have more value than parts, and wholes come first. Wholes are what defines the place and the mode of being of the parts, and so wholes have a kind of privilege as far as a source of value. We need to recognize that. So in this case of thinking about ecosystems, this would mean ecosystems themselves should take priority over any of the individuals in the ecosystems. In reply to this, Sober basically says, I don't see why it would be the case that wholes would be the only things that have value. Certainly. I mean, you could say that wholes sometimes have value that's different from the value of their parts, but I don't think we want to deny that the parts also have value. And sometimes it makes sense to choose what's valuable for some individuals in a system, even if it means that the system as a whole will change as a result. So to give some examples, Sober says it's hard to know what to say to a person, and he has in mind, arguing with an environmentalist. It's hard to know what to say to a person who would preserve the life of an endangered mosquito, like a mosquito that's part of an endangered mosquito species, over the life of a human being. If you would preserve a mosquito but let a human die, that just seems so crazy to Sober that the value judgment there is so far from what we normally would think is the right thing to do that it's hard to even know how to argue with such a person. And then the other example he gives is of, I believe it's Callcott again, who was describing a kind of nostalgia, or articulating a kind of nostalgia, or a positive view about the Stone Age relation of human beings to their natural environment, which was more symbiotic, that is, was more interconnected with the natural environment, maybe more dependent on the natural environment, certainly less affluent, less comfortable, less safe, but more thoroughly intertwined with the natural environment, and maybe more humble in relation to the natural environment. And again, Sober says, I'll leave it to the reader to decide whether they want to live like a modern human or they want to live like humans did in the Stone Age. Basically, challenging us to really ask ourselves seriously whether we would prefer to, whether we're willing to prefer and to promote returning to a condition of life that was so much worse for human beings, so much harder on them and their ability to survive, involved so much more suffering and so much more, so many more limitations. So again, the fact that humans no longer have this symbiotic relation to the natural environment has meant that the total system, the ecological system of the relation between humans and the environment has changed. But arguably, the change, which has been to the benefit of one part of the system, humans, arguably there are some parts of that change that are defensible and are good things and that we would want to preserve. And so this is supposed to point out the error of assuming that wholes and the operation of the whole system in a certain way is always the primary concern, rather than something about the well-being or the interests of individuals within the system. Now, the last major theme that Sober brings up is something he calls the demarcation problem. And he thinks that this is a problem, I should say, that this is a problem that a lot of environmentalist positions face. It's a kind of a challenge that he thinks they need to meet in order to have a defensible position. the challenge is this. How do you say which parts of the world overall deserve moral consideration, and how do you balance some of those considerations against others? So what we need is an account of when we should care about some organism or ecosystem or species, and how much we should care about it, and how our caring for that component of the world should be balanced against our caring for other parts of the world when those things come into conflict. We need some actual guidance about when species should be preserved, even at the cost of individuals. And Sober thinks that environmentalists have not given us that. They've given us a lot of very broad arguments to try to convince us that we ought to pay attention to species and ecosystems and so on. But they haven't told us really how much we should value those things in comparison with human interests or other concerns. And the last point that Sober makes is actually to present a pro-environmentalist argument that he thinks is more effective than any of these other arguments. And this is a very interesting part of his overall, his essay. And this argument is a kind of aesthetic argument. So the way he puts it is this, that it's possible for humans, once they have taken care of their basic human needs for safety and security and food and a certain degree of health and so on, to develop a kind of appreciation of nature, the beauty of nature, the wonder of nature, something like an appreciation of nature for its own sake. So he doesn't think this is something that, for instance, Stone Age humans had access to, or had access to very much or very often. But it is something that contemporary humans in relatively affluent places, like the United States and Europe, can develop. They can begin to appreciate nature for its beauty and wonder. And from this perspective, it might make sense to try to preserve nature in these beautiful and wonderful instances. So not all nature, not nature as such, but at least nature where it is recognized as beautiful. And I guess Sober would also have to recognize, kind of like Ralston discusses, that as we learn more about the natural world, as we do ecological science and biological science, we can come to appreciate kinds of beauty that we might not have noticed otherwise. So we might start to recognize insects, see insects as a kind of beautiful, extremely elaborate, intricate organisms that should be preserved and protected because of how beautiful they are. Whereas before we studied biology, we might think that insects are somehow icky or not beautiful. So I think that Sober would probably recognize that our aesthetic taste can be cultivated or can be developed through more experience with nature and maybe through kind of scientific study of nature. But the point here is that this is not a negligible consideration. I mean, if nature really is beautiful and wonderful in these ways, it can be experienced as such, then there can be good reasons for preserving it. Just like there are good reasons for preserving other beautiful things like works of art. So humans have come to value works of art, works of architecture. Think about, the value that humans place on, say, the cave paintings that were produced by our human ancestors 35,000 years ago, or the great works of the Italian Renaissance, by Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa and other painting of that type, or the French Impressionists, or the great musical recordings in, for instance, jazz in the 1940s through 1960s. If somebody came along and said, we have a policy that we're going to adopt, but it will involve destroying all of those jazz recordings, or it will involve it will involve erasing the paintings in the caves of Lascaux, then the cave drawings from 35,000 years ago, then I think a lot of people would be upset about that, and they would object to that, and they might protest, and they might try to stop the destruction of those beautiful and culturally significant things that they believe are valuable and worth preserving. In the same way, people can rally behind and protest and try to preserve natural beauty because they recognize those natural systems, species, ecosystems, and so on, as having a kind of value that deserves to be preserved. So Sober thinks that this is a good kind of argument, that this kind of argument may actually work, unlike the other arguments that he's considered.